Hi, everybody, and good morning. My name is Curtis Mitch. I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and welcome back to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today's Gospel for Monday, June 14th, comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. Now, just a quick reminder to you all, if you feel like these reflections are helpful to you and they're challenging you to grow in your faith and that sort of thing, please help us out as well by clicking the subscribe button below along with the notification bell. That way you will know every time a new reflection is being posted. Thanks. Now, today's reading comes to us from Matthew 5, verses 38 to 42. And in this passage, Jesus is telling us something rather shocking, something that should kind of get us to sit up and take notice. Jesus is calling us, challenging us as Christian disciples to suffer wrongs from other people rather than avenge those wrongs, all right? Rather than get even, rather than retaliate, we should be willing to suffer certain injustices, certain insults, indignities, those kinds of things, without actually striking back at the other person. And what we'll see is that this is Jesus dialing up the demands of the Mosaic law. He's going beyond what Moses said, and he's giving us a messianic teaching. In fact, this particular passage, as we described in a previous episode, this is one of Jesus' 6 antitheses, where Jesus does precisely that. In chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will say, "You have heard that it was said," and then he'll quote from the law of Moses, and then Jesus says, "But I say to you," and he makes an adjustment. He intensifies the law of Moses and gives it a messianic interpretation, right? So he's saying, in effect, that there's the teaching of Moses and then there's the teaching of the Messiah. Moses raised the bar this high. I'm raising the bar this high, and he's moving it up. In fact, it's essentially what he's doing is described in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, where Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of God." And so what Jesus is describing through each one of these antitheses is that greater righteousness that exceeds even the old covenant standard of righteousness erected by Moses. So let's read the passage and let's get into it and see what the Lord wants to teach us today. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who begs from you, and do not refuse him who would borrow from you." So what's Jesus talking about? Well, first, as we said, he's citing the law of Moses. He's citing what is known as the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. This is a legal formula that appears in the book of Leviticus, the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, we read an ancient law like that and we think, wow, how barbaric it must have been in Old Testament times. But we have to understand something important about this law. What is the purpose of this Mosaic law of retaliation? It's actually not an invitation to exact revenge. It actually places a limitation on revenge, okay? It's actually designed to curb the spread of evil, not to encourage the spread of evil, you might say, okay? And we say that because this standard of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is a standard of strict and just proportion. The idea is that when someone commits a crime and there's a punishment that goes with that crime, the punishment should equal the crime, equal the severity of the crime, but not exceed it, not go beyond it, all right? So that's the Mosaic law of retaliation. There's got to be that strict proportion. There's a limitation on how you can react. If someone knocks out your tooth, you can only knock out one tooth. That's the force and the spirit of this law, right? If somebody plucks out your eye, you can only pluck out one eye, right? That's the idea of strict justice and strict proportion. That's the law of Moses. Well, what about the law of the Messiah? What is the teaching that Jesus is giving us? Well, if Moses gives us a law of retaliation, Jesus sets up a standard of no retaliation, which is really quite striking and quite jarring in a lot of ways. I want to clarify something just at the outset here, that Jesus is not setting up a standard of just straight up pacifism. Jesus is not saying that Christian disciples should always and in all circumstances just be doormats, all right? He's not saying that. He's got a very particular context in view. Jesus is talking about these minor scuffles and run-ins that we have with other people in life, right? These little elements of friction that sometimes enter into our relationships with other people in life. He is not talking about major life-threatening situations. Jesus recognizes, the church recognizes that, of course, you're supposed to defend yourself. You can defend life when it's threatened. In fact, you can have a right and even a duty to do so if a father is defending the life of his children, that kind of thing. So Jesus is not calling us to a pacifism that has no exceptions or no particular application as though it's something universal. That's not what's going on. But what is going on? Jesus is here speaking about these situations in life where you are either insulted by another or imposed upon by another. So in this first instance, do not resist one who is evil, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Well, most people are right-handed, and so to be struck on the right cheek means that it's just a little backhanded slap. Okay, it's an insult, but it's minor enough that no real physical injury is possible here. You're just being insulted. And Jesus says you should be willing to bear it and be insulted twice and not just once, which is a mysterious thing for him to say. And then the second one, he says, if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. All right, let the offender satisfy his greed, just like the person who slaps you is kind of venting and satisfying their anger. So the person who would take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. Just give him both. And then the fourth thing, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now, you have to understand a little bit regarding this third point. You have to understand that Judea at the time of Jesus is an occupied country, all right? It's under Roman rule. And Roman soldiers had the right to compel people into service. So to force someone to go 1 mile means that a Roman soldier approaches you as a Palestinian peasant and says, I'm forcing you to carry my military equipment, all my gear, for 1 mile. And Jesus says, yeah, but a Christian should be willing to carry it even 2 miles, even though only 1 mile is demanded. And so what's he talking about in these three scenarios? Jesus is challenging us and calling us to suffer wrongs voluntarily, to suffer personal offenses voluntarily. Now, why would he do that? Okay, if the law allows you and gives the right to the people of Israel to exchange, to have this just proportion between an eye and an eye and a tooth and that sort of thing, why would Jesus do this? Because Jesus sees the Christian's mission as helping to neutralize the effects of evil in the world. I mean, this is how, according to Christ, this is how we stop that ping pong game of back and forth between people, where somebody does something in anger and the other person responds in anger, and then the first person responds again in anger, and then the cycle continues, okay? And it doesn't heal relationships, it just makes the divide wider. It makes the tension more and more uncomfortable, all right? And can escalate into more serious situations. So Jesus is calling his disciples to absorb the shock of these personal offenses, because instead of returning injury for injury, this is how the injury can stop. This is how the one who is evil, and that's what Jesus calls him, do not resist one who is evil. This is how one who is evil can expend themselves and then find peace at the end. All right? So the law of Moses allowed for a strict retributive justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus calls us as Christians to walk a higher road, and charity is that higher road. Why would Jesus call us to that? Well, that's what Jesus himself does, if you think about it. The Son of God became man for what purpose? To die on the cross, to suffer the evil, all the evil that the world could throw at him. Jesus suffered and suffered patiently without striking back, without retaliating, without avenging himself. And in doing so, in suffering that evil, Jesus was actually conquering it. He was triumphing over evil. He was stopping it in its tracks so it could proceed no further. And that's what Jesus is asking of you and me, right? In our own little ways, in these little minor, circumstances of relationships and daily life, is to live the mystery of the cross, to suffer evils that aren't major, that aren't terribly threatening, even if they're insulting, even if they impose upon us, that kind of thing. We suffer them because in doing so, we absorb the force of that evil and we end up conquering it. We end up triumphing over evil with what is good. I hope today's reflection was of some benefit to you. I pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day. And I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.